Blockchain Show is a podcast that demystifies cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technology.
This is the Blockchain Show. It's my great honor to welcome our guest today, John deVadoss, former managing director of Microsoft and the head of development at Neo Blockchain. John, welcome to the Blockchain Show. How are you?
Good morning, Ethan. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here, sir. Thank you for giving me your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we were talking earlier just before we started recording. You've been to SoCal before, so that kind of made me think a little bit about your background. So if you don't mind.
Yeah. So and again, just a bit of history. We can, delve into it as you like. Did my PhD work in machine learning, Ethan, back in the 90s, long before machine learning and AI was sexy and cool. At that time, it was the backwaters of computer science. Spent close to 2 decades at Microsoft. I was the architecture lead, worked on the strategy and the dev leadership for .NET, which is Microsoft's developer platform back, a long time, 1999, 2000, even before it was called .NET at that time. I also led the incubation and worked on the very early Azure platform. And once again, long before it was called Azure. In fact, the code name, Ethan, at that time was Red Dog, and we would have these red color shoes as a token of having worked on the very early Azure platforms. I also built Microsoft's enterprise strategy, which is where I spent time, in many parts of the world. I was in SoCal. I've been pretty much in every, I suppose, most geographic regions of the world, working with large enterprise customers, businesses, and nonprofit sectors as well. And also built up Microsoft Digital, which was my last gig at Microsoft. I was the GM of Microsoft Digital, and I built it up to be a $500 million business. And again, not to go into too much detail, but really learned about what it is to be a developer, Ethan, and to build developer platforms. The word platform, is much abused and disabused, but the key is platforms. Then there are developer platforms. And so I would say I really learned and understood what it takes to walk in the shoes of developers. And I'll tell you a small story here. And this is kind of a mental model I used, Ethan, at Microsoft to think about developers and platforms. I'm sure, you're in SoCal. I'm sure, you hike, you probably hike a lot. Hiking, you go uphill, you have probably a compass, perhaps some kind of a map application. You take water, maybe some, trail mix. You plan it out. It's work. It's fun, but it's work. And eventually, you reach up to the top, and then you make your way down. On the other hand, I don't know if you ski, but if you're a skier, when you ski, there is no compass, there is no map application. It's just fun. It's just, there's no friction. It's fluid. It's fast. And it's very enjoyable. And so for me, working on the .NET platform, working on the Azure platform, this visual imagery of developers being able to ski downhill as opposed to having to hike uphill is what drives me and motivates me to build in terms of the Neo, the M3 developer platform, Ethan.
It's really interesting. I like that analogy. Yeah, I'm kind of curious about the time frame when blockchain got on your radar and when you thought this is a viable solution for maybe some problems that you were addressing at work. Do you remember about when that time was?
Yes, I do. It's a little bit fuzzy, perhaps, but I do in the sense that I'll tell you a bit of my history. When I was I'm from India originally, Ethan. I went to school in India. I grew up in Tanzania in East Africa. When I went to school in India, I used to work on the mainframes. We had, punch card machines. So I've had the unique privilege of working on mainframe computers, PCs, client servers, the early web, the so-called Web 2, and then the cloud. And what drove me to the blockchain space, Ethan, is that in the history of computing, in the history of computing platforms, what we have here is the very first economic platform in computing. All previous waves of computing platforms, Ethan, have been passive plumbing platforms. Everything, including the cloud. And I'll tell you what this means. So we use Zoom, you use Excel, PowerPoint. These are applications. They start when we start them, and then they stop when we stop them. But you look at like a Bitcoin or a Ethereum or Neo, N3, these are institutions. They don't start when you start them. They don't stop when you stop them. They are self-governing. They are self-regulating, right? The word decentralized is much, bandied, Ethan. But frankly, I prefer the terms self-organizing, self-regulating. And so what blockchain platforms enable is for the first time in the history of computing, we have economic platforms and we're able to build institutions. And this is what motivates me to want to work in this space for the rest of my professional career and my life.
Yeah, I like that distinction because there's a lot of terms that get kind of thrown around in this space that even I find myself wishing I could go back and change but the terminology kind of evolves a little bit, but I feel like you've got a really good grasp on it. And I like how you put in developers first, at Neo. So maybe we should talk a little bit about Neo, if you don't mind, kind of
totally
giving us an overview on that.
Yeah. So with Neo, so first of all, Neo is a platform. It's a platform with the core vision of digitizing assets, and that's what motivates me to work on the Neo platform. The vision that assets will be digitized. That is the core thesis, Ethan, and it's hard to argue with that. The second aspect is, we said, look, if this is going to be a platform, platforms need developers first. And what we have done is to build the most developer-friendly blockchain stack in the industry. And why I say this is, having worked on .NET, having worked on and built much of the early Azure platform, I know what it takes in terms of the needs of a developer, of professional developers. To give you an example, a few years ago, when we began this work on building out the dev platform for N3, debugging was a challenging exercise across the industry. Would you believe it? Right? Even some of the leading players in the space in terms of debugging were challenged to use printfs and log statements. And so we said, look, this makes no sense. Platforms need developers. So how many developers are there? People talk about 50,000, 100,000, 500,000, and I have a very different perspective. If you look at the world, there are about 22 approximately million developers in the world. And so when people say we have 50,000 or 100,000, it's a drop in the ocean. But how do you attract, how do you motivate these 20 plus million developers to build? Well, you give them the tools, the languages, and the developer experience that they are used to and they are comfortable with. And that's what we have done. We said, look, if you go to an Amazon Web Services, right, and you want to build a Lambda function, takes a few minutes. You're done. You go to Windows Azure, you want to build an Azure function, takes a couple of minutes. And that's basically what we have done with Neo N3 is in about 2-3 minutes, be able to build a smart contract, to debug it, to test it, and to deploy it, all within the span of less than, I would say, about 5 minutes, right? And doing this in the language of your choice. If you like a Python, you like a C#, you like JavaScript, TypeScript, you like, it doesn't go, it doesn't matter. And that's the way it should be, Ethan, because, as a platform provider, you want to enable developers. You don't want to constrain developers, right? When I first saw, for example, Ethereum, in the early days, the notion that you had to learn a new language, a custom language, a new framework, a specific set of tools to be able to develop doesn't make any sense, right? You want to decrease friction, back to the skiing analogy. You want to make it fun. Anything that blocks a developer or developers in terms of time to market, time to develop, absolutely should not exist. And so that's what we have done. We've said, look, it's a polyglot, i.e. multi-language. It's the dev tool of your choice. We have made a bet on VS Code, which is used by about 60% of developers worldwide. And we said, look, we know how to do this. We have done this before at a Microsoft. And let's go do the same thing all over again. And that's basically the thesis, which obviously we have made very strong progress to. There are still many things that, in our backlog that I want to get done, which we will in the coming months and certainly over the next year and a half. But I would say at this point, I would put our platform, the N3 developer experience that we have built against any major software developers' tools and dev stack, and we would be right up there with them.
Yeah. Wow. That's awesome.
Thank you.
When I was reading about you earlier, what someone called the transition from Web 1 to Web 2, would you see there's any parallels to what you did at Microsoft with that transition to what you're trying to do with Neo, maybe from Web 2 to Web 3? Or am I reaching there?
No, it's a really good question, actually. I'm glad you asked this. It's a really good question in the sense that you're right. There is probably a pattern in terms of the shift from Web 1 to Web 2, and likewise from Web 2 to Web 3. The way I would describe this is the challenges that I faced leading the .NET architecture strategy team in terms of the shift from Web 1 to Web 2 was to evangelize, was to educate and inform developers that whilst Web 1 was a technology platform through and through, Web 2 was a social platform. And that was a hard change because developers were likely to say, okay, why do I care about a social stack? And it took some time for devs to realize, to understand that all platforms were becoming social. And that was because of the reach in terms of community engagement, whether it be with respect to consumers or it be developers and all the way in between. And likewise, right, today, if you look at the shift, and again, back to your question from Web 2 to Web 3, right, the shift is now Web 3 is economic platforms, back to my earlier point. And that's the hard, I would say, maybe hard isn't the right word, that's the challenging aspect for developers to appreciate, to understand. There is a shift now, right, from what are technology, maybe social computing platforms, to economic computing platforms. So what does it mean? Many things, but I would say fundamentally at the core, the notion of the sovereignty of the individual, that we, you, I, our friends, colleagues, families, we have the ability to manage, to control our data, access to our data, that we are truly self-sovereign in the design of these systems, which is why, again, I'm not a big fan of the term decentralized. I rather think of it as, self-sovereign, self-regulating, right? Self-governing. And that is the big shift that I would say for developers out there is, you're working in the Web 2 stack. The key is to appreciate, to understand that now we have a new wave of computing where incentives, economic incentives, crypto economic protocols are baked into the stack, as for example in N3. And that's why, what we build are not really apps, right? They are truly institutions. And like even the Web 2 apps, that's a big shift, and it will take some time, obviously, for the broader dev space. However, it is our job as platform builders, as platform providers, to ensure that we understand these emerging patterns that we know devs will be working on, and to make sure that we enable those developer patterns in the most friction-free way possible, and of course, to make it fun and enjoyable for developers to build, what they want to build.
Yeah, definitely. My son wanted me to ask you if you had anything to do with the Xbox at Microsoft.
Yes, sir. Yes, in fact, thank you for asking the question. In fact, a lot of the original .NET guys moved to the Xbox team because eventually, as you know, Xbox itself became a platform with respect to the app and the gaming ecosystem. So yes, I have a very small part to play, but I can claim some credit, and please thank your son for asking me the question.
Awesome. Yeah, that'll make him happy. Earlier when you were talking about that transition to Web3, something that I've thought a lot about is what it would take to get more widespread adoption. What are some hurdles? Is it the people not embracing the technology, or is it not accessible to them yet? You know, I've always wondered that.
That's a really good question, Ethan. I'm really glad you asked me this. So it's a really profound question. I'll give you sort of a multi-part answer. First, with respect to the domain awareness, we spoke about the shift, much like Web 1 to Web 2 was the social shift. Web 2 to Web 3 is the economic computing shift. That takes time. Web 2 did not happen overnight. It took multiple years, probably close to 6, 7, maybe even more. And so I would say we should be cognizant and empathetic that these shifts take obviously some time at scale. They're already happening, but at scale, it takes time. The second aspect is in terms of policy. I serve on the board of the Global Blockchain Business Council. We work on policy and standards with policymakers around the world, in the US, the EU, in Asia, and beyond. And so I would say standards. Now, when I say standards, it can be somewhat abstract, but to make it very pragmatic, very practical, for example, identity. The fact that, we are still, as an industry, we are still working to converge on standards for identity. So I would say broadly the space of ensuring interoperability, possibly even portability. It's an evolving space. I worked on these standards for the early cloud and for the early web services. We used to call them WS Star. Web Services Star was the set of protocols for open interoperable specs in terms of multiple platforms. And I've seen the movie before, and this is why I'm a part of the Global Blockchain Business Council, to ensure that we can put these in place. So it's the second aspect. The third aspect, as you said, obviously, is in terms of the domain itself. This shift reminds me again of the early days of the web back in 98, 99, right? Initial spike, possibly a bit of a plateau, and then this massive hockey stick sort of liftoff, right? And the same thing happened with the cloud. Having worked on Azure back in, 06, 07, 08, for a couple of years, it was kind of a little bit of a slow progress. People were still trying to grapple. What is the cloud? Why do I need it? Do I care? How does it work with my on-premise, and so on and so forth? The same way, I believe, and this might be a bit controversial, but I would say perhaps, this is a bit of a plateau, but maybe a good plateau in advance of the hockey stick of adoption. And why do I say this? I see, for instance, in terms of central banks around the world, central banks, over 85% of them right now, Ethan, are piloting CBDCs. It's coming. It's a massive shift. And it will prove that blockchain technology, ledger-based technologies, can be at the core of tomorrow's economic infrastructure. It's a huge proof point. Working with, obviously, nonprofit and corporate, organizations and sectors, I can see in terms of the emergence of NFTs. Now, when people talk about NFTs, oftentimes there is the perception of the GIF and the JPEG, right? But I'll give you a different perspective. We talk about digital, Ethan. So for me, the vision I see in terms of NFTs is anything that is paper today, and that is a multi-party piece of paper. Multi-party meaning there's more than one individual or organization involved, will become a non-fungible token. Think about it. You have a mortgage for a home, you have a lease on an automobile, you have an electricity bill contract with your provider. Everything will become an NFT. And this will be way, way bigger than what we think of in terms of NFTs being pictures and images and the like today. So the shift is coming. It's already happening. And these things, having seen this previously, right? It will be slow, and then all of a sudden everything shifts. And we look back and say, what happened? And then you're in the middle of the storm.
It's funny because when you were talking, I was thinking that it's kind of like a gathering storm on the horizon. I don't know if that's a good way to put it, because it's sometimes a storm can be destructive, but sometimes it can be like nurturing, or
yeah. I liken it to the north wind, Ethan. The north wind is going to be blowing very soon, and the north wind is going to be this massive shift right? And this is a reflection again of the state of our economic infrastructure in our country here across the world, the state of the dissatisfaction in terms of the social element in multiple countries, and obviously being spurred by this inflationary, or whatever you may want to describe, status quo. So it's all building up. I'll tell you what story. So again, at Microsoft, we would have this. As a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, a really smart guy, we would brainstorm, and what we came up with was, look, magic happens when social aspects, technology platforms, and economic conditions come together. Again, social aspects, technology platforms, and economic, constraints and needs and challenges. That's when magic happens. And if you look back in history, almost always it's been that way. And I think we are probably, like you said, in terms of the storm analogy, or I call it the north wind, I think we are probably very close to that point where, as they converge, we're going to see a fundamental shift with respect to asset digitization, with respect to self-governing, self-regulating, systems, institutions, and also with respect to broad developer understanding and adoption of these emerging self-governing, blockchain platforms, a la N3 and others.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When you were younger, working on all the different kinds of computers, did you ever see the world as it is today, with social media being so huge, where it can like influence people's thinking? Did you ever think that it would get to that point?
If I said yes, I'd be lying to you. However, as a kid, having read Huxley and Orwell, Brave New World by Huxley, and then of course Orwell's 84, the sense that technology would eventually get us there was always kind of, in the back of my mind. But I did not anticipate that Huxley would actually prove to be right in terms of how we walk into these webs that are woven for us, right? That was for me a very big surprise, Ethan. I did not anticipate that it would be a voluntary step into the into these webs as opposed to top down. So no, I did not necessarily anticipate, but having seen this, I do think that the way out of this is through self-governing, self-regulating, self-organizing systems, socioeconomic systems, not just economic, right? We look at blockchain today. I spoke about the shift from sort of technology platforms to economic platforms. What is the next big shift? These economic platforms, Ethan, have to become socioeconomic platforms, right? And that's when we know we have the fabric, the plumbing, the infrastructure to really build, enable tomorrow's communities, right? We're not there yet, but economic platforms is a huge step in that direction. And personally, I would like to be a part of this shift as we build what I call these socioeconomic platforms in the coming years.
Yeah, and I think you're really onto something, trying to attract the brightest minds, making coding accessible so it can just happen a lot quicker. I'm really hopeful for the future because, like you said, these tools that have incredible potential to make life better for everyone. And and I used to get a little hung up on the Orwellian stuff. I thought, oh, what if it's like authoritarian type use cases that get ahead of the more humanitarian. But I think it's going to be more, like I said, or like the people who want to make that magic, the social economic change. It's a great thing, these self-governing systems.
Absolutely. And again, the notion of self-sovereignty, right? That is critical, paramount. I think that is the foundation on which we build. Forget about decentralization, forget about all this, hoopla about, nodes and such, right? Think about self-sovereignty. That is what, right? As human beings, I think we owe this back to our fellow, human beings and our societies and communities to build these platforms. Building static plumbing technology, sure, there is value, but really, right? to be able to play a part, even a small part in building, as you said, these socioeconomic platforms. And again, I want to emphasize, right, for your listeners, self-sovereignty, right? That's what I believe is the key. And that's how truly, we lay down the rails, the platform for a society that, that can work together, come together for the greater good.
I wonder why some people get hung up on the decentralization. I don't know if that was like a buzzword earlier in the blockchain early days, but sometimes I wonder, like, I don't think people really care about decentralization. I think it's a tool, for some use cases, but it's been proven over the last few years that there's so many different ways to go about providing some of the things like you're talking about, self-sovereignty. But
precisely. No, you're absolutely right, Ethan. I think you're spot on in the sense that I'll give you sort of my hypothesis. I mean, I think it was a way, even the word decentralization, the word itself, the roots come back from against something, meaning that it's against centralization, which is not the way to go about building a new wave of technologies. You don't start out with a negative. You start out with a positive, right? You say, okay, this is about, for example, self-sovereignty, self-governing, self-regulating, which is also why I'm not a big fan of the term decentral, because it is against something, right? Why would you want to start off at the roots by being against something? Start by being for something. And you're right, there's been some, I think early on, perhaps some level of confusion maybe about how to think about, how to conceptualize these new platforms, these new technologies. And I think partly, Ethan, my view, my opinion is because many of the early people in the space were not really platform builders. They did not have the experience or the empathy of having built platform technologies. And so perhaps, we could say, look, yeah, they picked some terms that made sense to them. But of course, as we move along, I think we owe it to our developers, we owe it to our communities to be able to better articulate and to have more precise ways to thinking through what these platforms are, and also how to analyze them and how to compare and how to exploit them towards socioeconomic benefits, in my opinion.
That's spot on. Because we look back, and a lot of those early projects, they struggled so much trying to scale up as more and more people started using them. And you're right, I don't think it was a very developer focused mentality. So important.
That's right.
I wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe give us any thoughts you had about the blockchain space, maybe take it any way you want, predictions, or maybe
I'll certainly
give you the floor there.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you. So just to, in terms of how I would summarize it, I would say, let's, and this is more of a request, let's think of these as economic platforms on the way towards enabling tomorrow's socioeconomic platforms. We're not there yet, but I think we have a very strong foundation. I would emphasize, we think of these as self-regulating, self-governing, and really focus on, again, the self-sovereignty of the individual. I believe, focusing on the dignity of the individual, on the rights and the privileges of the individual, putting them at the center is how truly we can say we're making a difference. And I would say, again, as a developer and as a, at heart, and somebody who has built platforms used by millions and millions of developers worldwide, I would say the key is, platforms have to be developer friendly, a la N3, right? Have to be. Otherwise, it's not a platform, right? It's a ledger, it's a chain, perhaps, right? And to be developer friendly means that, you have to enable the tools, the experiences that, these developers are used to, having worked on multiple other stacks. And of course, last but not the least is to make it fun, to make it enjoyable. Developing software is in some sense art. It's science, of course, but it's also art. And so making it enjoyable, making it fulfilling is critical. And this is kind of what I bring in terms of building out the dev platform for Neo N3, is to really bring these ideals together to enable us to achieve this mission of building the economic computing platforms and the tools, targeting, again, I would say, remember, 20+ million developers. And this game is just getting started. It's just getting started, right? What a time to be alive.
Absolutely. Yeah, man, it's exciting. Wish I could go back in time. I would have studied developing instead of music.
Look, music is a great way to segue into software. I'll tell you why, Ethan, because, and it's going to be a soapbox, and please bear with me. Yeah, the way to think about software, developing software, is to think about patterns, design patterns, and I believe you look at art, music in particular, right? The notation, the vocabulary, the patterns, play center stage, and I see it very similar. In fact, I wish I had learned music when I was younger, Ethan, because it would help make me a better developer.
Oh, wow.
And I regret it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, man. Yeah, because you talk about it being like an art, and it's so true when you use an application and it just works and it's like magical. Like the experience is just it does something to you, it's like you feel like you're in the future. That artistic touch and
So
the
being
way
in the flow, right? Being in the flow,
yeah.
being in the zone, kind of that. Then we know we're doing the right things. Absolutely, no, you're spot on, Ethan, in the sense of being in the flow. And being in the flow is an artistic element, isn't it? In terms of music, in terms of architecture, and so. No, look. I think you did the right thing with your focus on music. In fact, it'd be a very easy segue to writing software. Much harder for me to go back to learn music now.
Yeah. Well, on that note, if there is anyone listening who maybe they do want to get into developing, would you have any advice for them on places they could start so one day they could be in a position where they could help progress this technology?
Oh, absolutely, Ethan. I would say two things. Firstly, the skill of reading and understanding code, I think, is often underrated. And I believe that's really where I would encourage people to start, to be able to read code, to go to GitHub, pick your favorite project or repository, just get a sense of how the team has developed the code. Reading code, in fact, I think is a much more critical skill than writing code, because if you can read code, then you have an understanding of the patterns, right? Then you can reuse and you can build on the shoulders of these other people. So I would say, to start off, there is this perhaps naive view that someone has to go in and learn a language or the tools and start writing code. I would say, in my experience, fundamentally flawed. Read code. And as you get to read more and more code, pick some time every day, maybe half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, just to read code. And you will find in about 6 months that the language of code is going to be more comfortable to you. And as the language of code is more comfortable to you, you will find yourself saying, okay, if I were to solve this problem, how would I do it? Would I use it, this pattern from this project, or perhaps this other pattern? And once you have this toolbox of patterns, then bingo, you're a developer. That's it.
Wow. You make it sound so easy.
And I'm happy to, if there are listeners, if you want to ping me, contact me offline, I'm happy to share more pointers. But again, I want to emphasize, right? Reading code is critically more important than writing code, right? Being able to understand what is in the project, in the code base. Then, as I said, once the language of code, you become comfortable conversing, then writing. The challenge, I would say, even the word mistake sometimes people do, is they jump in and say, I need to write code, or I have to write code. And that's completely upside down. So don't start there. Start with the reading. And then eventually, it's like, writing or creating music, right? You learn music, you learn to appreciate music. You play music from, obviously, the classical or whichever tradition you come in, you learn from the masters, and you eventually graduate to writing your own music. It's the same way in terms of software, I would say, or writing or fiction. You're a fiction writer, you read a lot, and you have a sense of, what does great fiction look like? And then you write. And the same thing for software. There's no difference, right? You can't just jump in and say, I'm going to write code, which I think, and I'm going to be very direct, very candid here, I think is a flaw, because many of these organizations are out to make money, and they say, okay, we'll teach you how to code. And each time I see something like that, I have to say, what the heck is going on, right? And yes, they make a lot of money, but you as a developer, I mean, anybody listening, right? Read code. That's all you need, and you'll become the best developer you can be.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. It does remind me in music when in jazz, they would always tell me to transcribe my favorite solos of the greats. And at first it's like, this is impossible. How am I supposed to listen and write it down like that? What? But the more you do it, you get a sense of how that person's mind works and the relationships. And so I can perfectly understand how that would translate over into coding. So that's really good, man.
Exactly. Yeah, precisely, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, this has been a really good talk, John. I appreciate you coming on. If you do want to leave us with any way that people can connect or learn more, please do so.
Yeah, certainly. But first of all, I want to thank you, Ethan. You're a busy man. I want to thank you. Appreciate you making time for me and for the very insightful questions. And I think you pushed me in a few places, and I appreciate the discussion and the back and forth. Always happy to connect. I'm always happy to, if I can help in any way. People can ping me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Send me a connection request. Very happy to follow up and have a, and share. Like I said, I want to, if I can help anybody to be able to understand, to better understand, and to use these emerging technologies and platforms for the greater good, I'm always at your service.
That's great to hear. Well, thank you so much for your time, John. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate it.